Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's eClaims June webinar. My name is Anthony Contento, and I'm the Program Manager with the eClaims unit. Joining me today is Mike Hunter, who's a Project Coordinator for the eClaims unit. During today's presentation, please keep your phone lines muted, as we will be using the chat feature to receive your questions today. You can enter your questions throughout the presentation by using the chat box, which is located on the right side of your screen. Use the drop-down box to then send your questions to the panelists. You can also hover over the WebEx tab at the top of your screen and click on the chat option. So for today's webinar, we'll be going over the following agenda items: the recent updates for Release 3.1, the most frequent error we've seen in 3.1, going over the new edits that will become effective on September 15th of this year. And we'll also discuss future updates, and then finally, with the time that we have left, go over any questions that you may have submitted. So for the recent updates, there was an update to DN0059, which is the manual classification code, and that was posted to the board's website on April 18th. April's eClaim webinar is now available to review on the eClaims presentation page on the board's website. And there was also a clerical edit to DN0154, which is the employee ID assigned by the jurisdiction, and that was implemented on April 29th, and an updated element error text on DN0154117. For DN0036, which is the part of body injured code, population restriction DN0036-065B was relaxed on May 19th. Claim administrators can now submit multiple head or multiple neck codes without needing to reach that 10 parts of body codes threshold. And we hope to have our next change log published within the next couple of weeks. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mike so he can present the next part of our webinar. Mike?
Thank you, Tony. Next, we want to go over the most frequent error that we've seen in Release 3.1 to date. And that error actually has to do with Agreement to Compensate Code, DN0075, and the population restriction for 064K. We ran an error report through the eClaims leadership team, and we found that this Agreement to Compensate Code population restriction is currently our top error. So for DN75, Agreement to Compensate Code, it should not be included in the change variable segment on SHROI 02 if it's the same value as previously reported, unless you're now trying to indicate you're accepting a medical-only claim after a denial. What we wanted to do is give everyone an example of what you should do and what you shouldn't do. What we would expect, as an example, a FROIO with Agreement to Compensate Code of L with liability. Then you submit a SHROI 04 with Agreement to Compensate Code of null blank. And then when you go to accept the claim, you file a SHROI 02 to accept that claim after the denial and include Agreement to Compensate Code of L and include that in the change variable segment on that SHROI 02. What we would not expect, a FROIO with Agreement to Compensate Code of L, a SHROI IP, the initial payment, with Agreement to Compensate Code of L again, with liability, the SHROI SA, reported Agreement to Compensate as null blank, which would be expected. And then the SHROI 02 is filed with Agreement to Compensate Code of L in the change variable segment as add. We would not expect that since you had never removed L in that case. As Tony had mentioned earlier, we also want to go over some of the new edits that are effective on September 15th of this year. The following are the new edits that were posted on our changelog back on March 15th of 2022, with that 6 months notice provided in accordance with the Claims EDI standard for IAIBC. Changelog item 304 was a population restriction for the date claim administrator had knowledge of injury. This one was a typo in the population restriction that we were correcting. For changelog item 311, again, a population restriction change for DN 85 benefit type code. There were other population restrictions that needed to be removed, and this accommodated the removal of those other restrictions by renumbering and relettering. And changelog item 312 was again a population restriction change, this time for DN 192, benefit payment issue date. And this was to prevent agreement to compensate code from being without liability if the payment issue date is greater than 365 days in the past. As many of you are aware, we've had those requirements in place since 3.0. This population restriction is just enforcing that. Next, I want to go over the future updates for release 3.1. As Tony had mentioned earlier, we hope to have the next changelog published within the next couple weeks. And what we do is we take all the feedback from our trading partners and as much as possible. When we can, we do tweak edits, relax edits as much as we can. And some of that feedback should be reflected in our next changelog that we publish in the next couple weeks. We encourage folks to continue submitting feedback to us. You can submit it through the eClaims mailbox, or you can always feel free to send it to us directly as well. We take that feedback and review it between the project team as well as our technical team. And if we're able to accommodate a relaxation of an edit, we are always happy to do so. As we relax future edits, we will continue to share those in future communications. And lastly, I just want to also remind folks regarding the filing of Freud. Previously, we had mentioned in previous webinars that with the onboard system, we use the routing based on senders for the prior authorization requests. So just a quick reminder to folks that you should make sure you have your FROI filed on any cases that you have open for either medical or indemnity, just to make sure that those prior authorization requests are routed to your appropriate dashboard. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tony.
Thanks, Mike. So we're now going to begin the question and answer period of today's presentation. As a reminder, please use the chat to send us your questions by either hovering over the WebEx tab at the top of your screen and clicking on chat, or by using the chat box if it's open on the right-hand side of your screen. And also, please send your questions to all of the panelists. We will read your questions out loud, and then a representative from our project leadership will be responding. Now, you may hear some brief silences throughout the Q&A as we're reading the questions you may have provided to us. A brief silence is going to begin now, so please give us a few moments to review your questions, and we will get back to you shortly. Thank you.
There's a question regarding DN75. Once it's reported, should it be dropped from all other transactions? It depends on the element requirement table. Agreement to compensate code is required on certain maintenance type code, so it does depend on which Troy MTC you're reporting. For example, on the Troy SA, it would not be reported per the standard. There's a question regarding net to zero and if we've received any feedback currently, and we have not received much feedback from trading partners on net to zero to date. Another question about the PAR, and if you haven't updated your system and it's an inactive claim rep, it's based on you as a sender. So If you're ABC Insurance and you filed the FROI, it's going to route to ABC Insurance's dashboard. Also, if you haven't filed the FROI, the system does have logic to attempt to route it to the responsible insurer. There's a question regarding whether changes can be made to denial codes on the FROI or SHROI 02. In release 3.1, no. We would expect the FROI or SHROI 04 as the follow-up to make the amendment to that. The reason we did that was that document actually gives you all the controverted stuff and also is in your PDF zip file. So that way for folks who have any of their mailing automated, they don't have to go manually pick up that 02 transaction. There's a question regarding if we would accept this SHROI 02 to reclassify benefits paid to add or delete one. It depends on the specific circumstance. I would encourage you, if you're getting a rejection, to email the eClaims mailbox. We do, in very limited circumstances, if a mistake is made, allow you to replace that previous benefit on an 02. But in many instances, the standard would potentially call for a SHROI CB, for example, if you're reclassifying a benefit and changing. Just to put that one out there, but it would depend on the specific circumstance.
So before we conclude today's presentation, I want to make sure that you're aware of methods to stay informed of eClaims news and also upcoming engagement opportunities. You can visit the eClaims website at wcb.ny.gov to stay up to date on eClaims news. You can also sign up to receive news straight to your email inbox. This is how we will be communicating on future engagement opportunities. Visit the eClaims site and select WCB notifications within the eClaims overview section. Questions, comments, and feedback on eClaims EDI 3.1 can be emailed to eClaims@wcb.ny.gov. You can also follow the board on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. A recording of this webinar is going to be placed on our YouTube and eClaims website, as well as any FAQs spawned from the questions being asked during this webinar series. So please keep an eye out for these resources, as well as the follow-up email and survey. I want to personally thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day and watching this presentation. Thank you very much.